Morning, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to first take this opportunity to acknowledge the ancestral lands that we are gathered on today. I'd like to acknowledge Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, recognizing we're in their traditional territory, so Haitsepka. I also like to take this opportunity to recognize some of our colleagues, friends around the room. I'm going to start with the First Nations Summit, Cheryl and Robert Phillips, who are task group members, also our co-chairs, Leah George Wilson, Ray Harris. I also wanted to acknowledge my staff and their dedication and hard work, and they're joining us in the room. We have Mark Smith, Odette Wilson, Sashia Liang, Nancy Olding, who's outside, Dan Gill, who's inside, and Tanisha Williams, who is down outside, greeting and welcoming everyone to our launch of our 2015 annual report. Also, my colleagues and commissioners, Jerry Lampert, Tom Happynook, and Francis Frank are here with me as well. And to the media, who have taken this opportunity to join us this morning as we launch our annual report, which is titled Treaty Negotiations, Process and Progress. I believe everyone has been provided a copy of our annual report. And so what we decided to focus on, recognizing the critical importance of treaties and the role of the Treaty Commission, is to clarify our role in treaty negotiations and the process in British Columbia. The focus was highlighting the importance of resolving the land question in British Columbia, and that this is a constitutional imperative mandated by Section 35 of the Constitution. It's also a blueprint for reconciliation. That is, the treaty negotiations process is a blueprint for reconciliation. We thought it was important to highlight that aspect in our annual report. The main goal, of course, is achieving reconciliation in British Columbia between three parties: Canada, British Columbia, and First Nations. We have the opportunity to be at the forefront of reconciliation in British Columbia. We are the only tripartite body in Canada that promotes and facilitates reconciliation in this country. Our mandate is to support reconciliation by facilitating fairly negotiated and honorably implemented treaties. That's our role. We have a successful process in British Columbia, and we're here to say we're supporting that process, and that's what we wanted to cover in this year's annual report. The main themes are independence. The Treaty Commission explored independence in three different ways: as facilitator, funding, and process. So in facilitator on page 6, part of our role is to provide opinions about treaty negotiations. We're not an agent of the principles. We're also independent through our legislation and statutes. That's an important foundation of the Treaty Commission. Funding, that's located at page 8. Our role is to ensure that there's a level playing field amongst First Nations in British Columbia when they're engaged in treaty negotiations. We also recognize that there are some challenges around the debt growth and the fact that there's discussions around creating an exit strategy for those that have found that perhaps treaty negotiations at this time is not the appropriate venue for them seeking reconciliation. Process at page 10. We are the independent voice of treaty negotiations in British Columbia. Part of our role is providing information and public education with regards to treaty negotiations in British Columbia. Our annual report is a significant tenet of that public education, as well as our updates and quarterly reports that we provide to the principals on a quarterly basis. Our roles and responsibilities. You'll note on page 12 that we discussed the roles of the three parties: Canada, British Columbia, and First Nations. We thought it was important to highlight roles, responsibilities, but really to describe everyone's collective role in the treaty negotiations process and highlight the fact that we have a process, and it was our duty to share what our process, what our role is, what our job is with the general public. Equally important, treaty negotiations are based on mutual respect, shared responsibility. As previously articulated, we all have a role as British Columbians and Canadians to ensure that we build mutually respected relationships through treaty negotiations. I also wanted to highlight some of the areas that we covered off in our role is around governance. We've held 2 forums, or 1 forum on governance. 1 will be coming up with regards to multi-nation First Nations communities. And what we're looking to do is build a best practice guide that enables First Nations to come together, to strengthen their governance, to share best practices, and we support that work. We support First Nations having a venue to come together, to share experience, to share knowledge. That only strengthens nations when they're looking at implementing self-governance. Overlap shared territory. We didn't want to spend a lot of time, given the fact that we had spent last year's annual report on shared territory overlaps recommendation 8. So starting at page 20, we do talk a little bit about the thorny issue, but more or less highlighting that First Nations are best poised to resolve these issues amongst themselves with the support and the dedication of the Treaty Commission. We have an interest in supporting First Nations finding resolution and solutions to their issues. Another theme focused for this year is a view of progress. We've undertaken a study with Deloitte and Touche to study the socioeconomic benefits of treaty making, and we found that the results will be key to understanding the socioeconomic benefits of treaty making and really looking at the return of investment in the BC treaty negotiations process in British Columbia. When that report is released, we'll be able to share it and share the findings, and also look at ways to partner with other stakeholders to continue that work for First Nations so that they can build best practices and milestones within their communities when they're looking at assessing the socioeconomic impacts of treaty negotiations. One of the key features of this year's annual report is looking at the map on page 23. I think the map really signifies and it demonstrates that things are accelerating in British Columbia. There is a requirement for commitment and dedication by all 3 parties to move to completing and implementing treaties in British Columbia. We have currently 65 First Nations or 105 Indian Act bands, which represents 52% of First Nations in British Columbia negotiating in the treaty negotiation process. We wanted to highlight that in this year's annual report. We also wanted to highlight the number of completed treaties, implemented treaties, completed final agreements, final agreement negotiations, initialed AIPs or land and cash offers, and completed agreements but not yet ratified, because this really highlights the success of the process in British Columbia. It highlights the opportunities that we have in treaty negotiations if we just move and push some of those parties to completing. There are a number of them just on the cusp, ready to go, and that is our job as a Treaty Commission, is to support those nations in finding conclusions to their treaty negotiations process and supporting them moving forward to self-governance. That map on page 3 represents 1/3 of British Columbia if they're completed and implemented. It's 35 Indian Act bands that is in that highlighted map area. One other feature in our annual report is the status reports on page 28. You move to page 28 and beyond, that will highlight the status of treaty negotiations in British Columbia nation by nation. And again, it demonstrates that there are a significant number of First Nations in treaty negotiations successfully negotiating in the process that we have here in British Columbia. So those are the highlights that I wanted to bring to everyone today. Wanted to acknowledge and thank everyone, particularly my staff and my colleagues. And I will now open it for questions. Haitsapka. And I can moderate questions. I'll look to the media. Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit more about the report that you're working on. Is that finished or?
We're in the process. It's almost completed. It's been a 3-year study, and it was looking at interviewing a number of First Nations that have either completed treaties or in final stages of treaties, and also looking at First Nations that maybe have implemented other forms of jurisdictions like land code, taxation authority. And part of that was interviewing to figure out, at the end of the day, what are the impacts to their community? What are the positive impacts that treaties have brought around? And some of the analysis is that clearly there are significant positive socioeconomic benefits when a nation is out from under the Indian Act and implementing their own governance moving forward. Do you want to add anything? Any additional questions? No? Go.
You talked a little bit about debt loads and
Yes.
working to help First Nations reduce their debt loads. Can you speak a little bit more to that and what's happening in that area?
There's a number of things happening in that area. One of them is there's been significant changes within the funding authorities, allowing the Commission to provide more contribution funding and have First Nations not take down their loan portion. That's one way we've been able to decrease the amount of debt and slow the growth of the debt. The other process is through a treaty revitalization table, which is tripartite. My colleague behind you, Dan Gills, and Mark Smith both participate in that process, and the principals, so Canada, BC, First Nations, are looking at ways to really solve this issue. That work hasn't quite completed itself yet, and so we're hoping that work will be completed by the end of the year. We'll move to the principles for endorsement and then implementation, and part of that is looking at slowing the debt by providing more flexible funding options through contribution funding. That's just some of them. See if my colleagues have anything to add to that. No? Okay. Any further questions? You can go. Go.
So, looking at this, what are your goals going forward? What are you going to be working on over the next year?
You want to go?
Yeah. Maybe I'll have a first go at that. I think a major goal for us is to move along those First Nation negotiating tables that are close to final agreement or have agreements in principle moving to final agreement. We'd like to see a focus to see that we complete as many of those as possible. The report points out that in the past year, we've actually seen 4 First Nations sign agreements in principle. That's the most we've had in 1 year. That's an encouraging sign. We want to work with those First Nations to move towards final agreement. But then there are those who are leading to agreements in principle, and so we want to work with them. So a big goal is to move those along. Another goal is to really work with First Nations on dealing with overlap and shared territory issues. This becomes more important as First Nations get closer to final agreement, and there's a lot of effort going into that. We're also working with First Nations on ratification procedures, helping First Nations in more advanced stage to come together to talk about the best method to arrive at a successful ratification. So that's going on as well. So we have at least those 3 areas, and my colleagues may want to add other areas that are part of our goals for the next year.
Any additional comment?
No, good.
I think one of the other goals, and I'm just going to say it, is the appointment of a chief commissioner. I think that's extremely important for our organization, recognizing that's a goal that the principals will need to get together, notwithstanding the fact that there's a federal election next week, and appoint a chief commissioner to the BC Treaty Commission. Though we have internally made a decision with regards to an acting chief commissioner, but I also think that that's a goal moving forward.
Yep.
Any last and final questions?
Does anyone else have a question?
That's okay.
I have a few, but it's inappropriate.
Oh, Jerry.
Okay.
I mean, if there's no additional questions, then will be around. Leah.
Could you say a little bit more about the work that you've done with, I think you said Deloitte?
Sure. So we've partnered with Deloitte to help enable us to understand better the socioeconomic impacts of treaty negotiations in British Columbia. And they've identified several nations where they've taken, I guess, a real in-depth interview process with nations that have either completed treaties or close to completing treaties, and who may not have been in treaty negotiations but may have drawn down other jurisdictions such as land codes, taxation authority, or might just be under Indian Act governance. So looking at getting a variety of First Nations who are doing, I guess, a variety of different governance options, and then assessing the positive impacts of treaty negotiations. And it's been a 3-year process, and our findings so far, recognizing that there is more work that needs to be done to assist this conversation and move this conversation forward, that there are positive impacts to nations moving away from the Indian Act jurisdiction only. So there's positive, I guess, socioeconomic benefits under land code. There's positive socioeconomic benefits to a community that have undertaken implementation of treaty negotiations. And so what we're looking at is, when the report will be released, it will be on our website and shared with everyone. But we're also looking at how we can support this work moving forward, because I believe there's going to be a need for a second stage, because right now we've just been benchmarking and trying to set the data and the questions to ascertain the data to support these socioeconomic impacts. Yes?
And in the report, you had a section on public education.
Mm-hmm.
Is public education the responsibility of all the parties at the table? And it is. I'd like to know how one can compel the other parties to increase their amount of public education. This report that's coming this year coming up, will be important for the whole public to understand what are the benefits of treaty making. I just would like to know, how can we compel the other parties to get in the game, so to speak?
Great question. I think the task force report actually acknowledges that it is a 3-party responsibility for public education. And not sure about compelling. Recommendation 17 is where all parties are responsible for public education. Around compelling, I think that's a difficult conversation, and I would hope that maybe something out of the treaty revitalization process would provide some more strength around that word compel. But I think you've highlighted something, that there is a obligation on British Columbian Canadians to understand what's happening in treaty negotiations, in particular the socioeconomic benefits. And that's clearly a role that we'll continue to do, and we'll advocate for the treaty negotiations process, but more importantly to fulfill our role and our mandate in public education. But I think there's still more work to be done, and there's more partnerships that need to be made. Jerry?
Yeah, if I could add to that. I think in a real sense, the commitment of Canada and BC to engage in public education has slipped off the table, broadly speaking. So we're carrying the load on that, we, the BC Treaty Commission. But I think it's also important to point out that in a situation where a First Nation is in an advanced stage of negotiation, there is an effort to communicate with the public, both members of the First Nation, non-Aboriginal people who live in the area where a treaty is being negotiated. I think Canada and BC do work on that. Some of it is deemed consultation that they're required to do, but they also do some general public relations work. It's interesting, I think municipalities are doing more and more of the reach to the broader community to explain what's going on. So there's some of it going on locally, but in terms of the broad, you know, in our case, provincial-wide effort to educate the public, I think there's been serious slippage over the last few years on the part of Canada and BC. And maybe we just have to keep reminding them at this stage.
Any further? Absolutely.
I see here in the overlap section that one of the key ideas that came out of your forum in March was the idea of creating a panel of experts to help deal with this issue. Can you talk a little bit about that and where that idea is at?
Sure. Does anyone else want to? No? Okay. So it's propelled us to think a little bit more strategically around perhaps a structured process and what that might look like moving forward, which would ensure that there is a structure for First Nation engagement, and whether it's, you know, the Commission would be developing and supporting that process, and that could include something like an expert panel that would be a quasi-deciding body around the structured process, but really it's around nation-to-nation engagement and how we ensure that there's a process that has timelines, outcomes, and that both nations agree to it. So that's something that we are sort of piloting with a couple of First Nations that are engaged in nation-to-nation engagement. And that's something that we're looking to build upon and further redefine as this process continues to unfold. Yeah. Any lasting questions? Cheryl.
Not that I want to put anybody on the spot, but I think it's quite obvious that the fact that we don't have a chief commissioner in place is because British Columbia decided that unilaterally that they weren't interested in appointing a chief commissioner. And so for a lot of First Nations who were in the process, as well as for the Commission, that caused a lot of concern. And in speaking with Minister Rustad, he indicated that the reason being is that they think that there's different ways of reaching other agreements or alternative agreements with First Nations who want to move faster in the process. And we've heard and we've talked about how he says he has 12 nations that are ready to move forward right here and right now. He's mentioned that to us as a summit, and I know he's mentioned it to you. Have you guys had a conversation with Minister Rustad since then to find out exactly who these 12 tables are and how British Columbia thinks things are going to move ahead?
Do you want to start?
Sure. Just to deal with the last part of your comment, we've indicated to Minister Rustad and to his senior officials that if they would like our input on what tables we think could be accelerated, we're prepared to do that. But we haven't had a response, to that as yet. I think, though, that we're very troubled by the fact that we've not seen progress in appointing a chief commissioner. At the last principals meeting, which was a few months ago, Canada and the First Nations Summit indicated they were prepared to move on appointing a chief commissioner. BC said no. It's difficult to understand why they would refuse at this point, because regardless of what tact might be taken to move the process forward, not having or having a chief commissioner could only benefit the process. We continue to operate. We had the authority to appoint an acting chief commissioner. We did that in appointing Celeste. So we continue to operate. So I don't understand. I don't understand BC's rationale for not agreeing to appoint a chief commissioner, because the process is going to continue. And hopefully, after the federal election and, perhaps early in the new year, BC will agree with Canada and First Nation Summit to get on with appointing a chief commissioner.
That sums it up. Last questions, if there's any. All right.
Thank
I
you.
think that's it. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thanks very much.